My name is Amanda Cole, and I am 38 years old, and today I flew for 8 straight hours just to make it to the event they told me about in the most polished way possible, and in my hands I held a carefully wrapped gift, something I had worked on for weeks, hoping maybe this year would be different. Maybe this would be the one time they would look at me as more than an outsider. Maybe they would let me in without judgment, without hesitation. But the moment I reached the front steps, everything I had carried, all the hope, all the patience, all the effort shattered in a single breath. Because the person who met me at the door was my sister, and her eyes were cold without a hint of warmth, and she looked straight at me and said the words that I somehow knew were coming but still broke me in half. She said, "You are not family anymore." And she said it like it was the most natural thing to say, like it was fact, like it had always been true. And right behind her were the two people who had raised me, my mother and my father, and they stood there in complete silence, and not once did they blink or step forward or even flinch, as if what she said was something they had already accepted, something they had agreed to a long time ago. And in their eyes I could see it. I could see that they had already erased me. I was just the one who had not accepted it, yet I did not scream, I did not beg, I did not ask why, because I already knew the reason. It was written on their faces plain. Permanent. I turned around and walked away, gift still in my hand, something even heavier pressing against my chest. And they must have thought that was the end of it. They probably believed that shutting the door would be the final act. But they had no idea what I had been holding back, or how quickly things could crack when truth was given a voice. And within one single hour, the celebration inside that venue would fall apart in ways none of them were ready for. Before I get to what was said, before I show you how it all came undone, let me take you back, let me explain how we reached this point. Because the story of the Cole family is not what the world saw in our photos and holiday cards. It never was. My parents, Gregory and Margaret, were known in public as business owners, full of charm and influence. They ran Cole Event Group, one of the biggest names in wedding and corporate events across Colorado, and on the outside they looked like the ideal pair, always giving speeches about success and entrepreneurship and legacy. But inside our home, the rules were different. They were unspoken, but they were clear. The closer you were to the family business, the more value you had. My sister Brooke was always at the center. She joined them at meetings, followed them to site visits. She used words like brand and legacy, like she had been born for the role. She was their mirror image, and they adored her for it. I, on the other hand, kept the house clean, got perfect grades, and did my best to make them proud. But the moment the topic turned to Cole Event Group, I disappeared from the conversation. I was told I was good at numbers. Teachers recommended finance or accounting. I wanted to follow that and build something of my own, but my parents had one reply every single time: "How are you going to use that to help the business?" It was never about what I wanted. It was always about what would serve the Cole name better. When I turned 20, I got invited to what was supposed to be a company retreat. It was a mix of staff and family, scheduled at a mountain lodge for the weekend. I packed my bag, showed up at the meeting spot only to find an empty parking lot and a single text saying the plans had changed and they had left the night before. No apology, no explanation, just silence. And when they opened their flagship venue downtown, I found out about it in a newspaper article. There was a photo of Brooke and my parents standing proudly under the giant sign, smiling for the press. My name was not mentioned once, and I had not even known the opening was that day. After that, I decided I would not wait for invitations anymore. I went to college, earned my degree, and opened a small accounting practice, helping local businesses with their books. It was not glamorous, but it was mine, and I felt proud of it. But even then, my parents said it was just a hobby. They told me if I wanted to make a real difference, I should be part of something bigger. And by that they meant their company, not mine. The only time they called my work useful was when their own systems started falling apart. One of their senior accountants quit without notice, and that was when my father called and asked if I could come help for a while, just until they found someone new. He said it would be a chance to show what I could do inside company. Part of me still wanted that chance to feel like I belonged, so I said yes, and I joined for what they called a temporary stretch. But once I stepped inside, I saw things I could not ignore: payroll records that did not match, hours logged, overtime mysteriously missing from reports, staff being Told to clock out before cleanup was done. When I asked questions, they brushed me off, told me it was normal, that I was making too much of it. Then I started reviewing the relief grants they had received during the pandemic. The money was supposed to be for keeping staff employed and covering vital expenses, but the records showed something else: side accounts receiving large transfers, money being spent on executive perks, hotel stays, cosmetic upgrades for venues, all under the radar, none of it listed in the grant documentation. I brought it up in a management meeting. I laid out the numbers, the concerns, and the response was smooth, practiced, almost too clean. They said it was timing differences, internal shifts, nothing improper. But I saw it in the room. Everyone froze and something shifted after that email stopped, including my name. Doors that were once open now closed quietly. When I walked by, they still called me family, helping out, but I knew I had crossed a line, one they never wanted me to approach. And that was when I started quietly saving copies of everything: time cards, payroll summaries, emails, internal memos, grant reports, anything that showed the truth of what was happening. I told myself it was just caution, just good accounting practice, but deep down I knew I was building a lifeline for the day they might turn on me. And eventually that day came. They thanked me for my help, gave me a short message about restructuring, and let me go. No drama, no accusations, just a polite goodbye. And I walked out of that office feeling smaller than I had in years. I went back to my tiny practice and my small list of clients who actually valued honesty, and I tried to move on, telling myself it had been a lesson, nothing more. But then something strange happened a few weeks later. A formal envelope arrived, thick card, elegant design, gold lettering, their anniversary invitation, and it felt more like a press release than a family message. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if going would mean anything, or if it would just be more of the same: more silence, more exclusion. Something in me could not stay away, not again, so I booked a flight, packed a few simple things, and flew across the country, hoping maybe this time would be different. But now, standing in front of that door, with Brooke blocking me and my parents behind her like statues, I knew it had never been different. They had decided long ago that I was not one of them, and this was just the first time they said it out loud. And as I walked away holding that gift and that ache in my chest, I knew this time the story would not end quietly, not with me disappearing again, not with me walking away and saying nothing. I was done being the one they ignored because they had no idea what I had taken with me, and they were about to find out just how much damage silence can hide. The door had closed behind me, and I kept walking, not because I knew where I was going, but because I could not stand still, not after what just happened, and not with that gift still in my hand, and 1,000 thoughts racing through my mind, and my feet moved almost on instinct, one step after another, like they had a mission, even if my head had not caught up yet. And I walked for blocks, not stopping, not pausing, until I reached the edge of a busy intersection. And on the corner stood a small cafe tucked between two shops, and its lights were soft and golden, and something about that made me feel like I could breathe again just for a moment. So I walked in and chose the quietest table in the far corner, and set my bag down and unwrapped my scarf, slowly trying to gather myself, because the humiliation was still fresh, the burn of rejection still sharp. And as I wrapped my hands around a warm cup that cooled faster than I could drink it, my mind began to drift back into memories I had tried so hard to forget. But they were there now, wide open memories of the time I spent working in their office just a few years earlier, when they had called me asking for help because their accountant had left suddenly and they needed someone they could trust. And I remember how Gregory pitched it to me, said it was an opportunity to prove myself, said it was a chance to really show what I could do for the family business. And part of me wanted that. Part of me still believed that maybe if I helped, maybe if I showed them what I could do, they would finally see me as someone who belonged. So I said yes, and for a few days it actually felt, oh, hey, like maybe this time would be different. I had my own desk, a pile of spreadsheets to sort through, and the title of interim accountant that they only said out loud When clients were not in the room and then the documents started piling up and things stopped feeling okay because the numbers did not match, not in a small way, but in ways that felt deliberate, and there were time cards with missing hours shifts that had clearly gone longer than what the report showed, and when I checked the draft versions and compared them to the final submissions I saw it, the overtime was being deleted, and employees were being clocked out before cleanup was done, and when I asked why I was told it was standard practice industry norms that I should stop asking too many questions and just do the job, and still I kept going until I found the grants, the ones they got during the pandemic money, that was supposed to support employees and keep the lights on, but when I followed the trail, that money ended up somewhere else. It went to new lobby tiles and personal travel. It paid for things that had nothing to do with survival or staff welfare, and I remember how my stomach turned when I realized what I was looking at, and how I brought it up during a management meeting, laid it all out in a simple report with footnotes and highlighted rows, and I can still see the way the room changed, not because they were surprised, but because I had dared to say it out loud. The silence that followed was louder than any denial. And from that day on, I stopped being part of the team. My emails were ignored, my calendar cleared out, I became invisible, and no one told me outright, but I knew they were pushing me out, so I started saving things quietly. Every document I touched, I copied. Every spreadsheet, every grant memo, every payroll summary, I kept it all backed up and hidden, not because I knew what I would do with it, but because I knew I needed to, and when they finally let me go, it came with a fake smile and a short email about restructuring, and I walked out of that building with nothing but a flash drive and 100 silent truths that they never thought I would carry, and now here I was again years later, still trying to be part of that world, still hoping to be accepted. Instead, they slammed the door in my face and told me I was not family, and in that cafe with its dim lights and the steady hum of quiet conversation around me, something finally shifted. It was like all the years of holding back, all the years of trying to be polite or understanding finally snapped, and what remained was something clear and sharp and calm, not rage, not revenge, just resolve. And I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder I had not looked at in so long, and there it was, row after row, document after document, all waiting, all intact. And the more I scrolled, the more it confirmed what I already knew, that what they were doing was wrong, not just unethical, but illegal. And I thought about what to do with it, who would believe me, who could help me. And then I remembered an article I had read about 6 months ago about another company that had been exposed for misusing pandemic funds. And the story had been published by a journalist named Alicia Park. She had laid out the facts with precision, no drama, no emotion, just truth. And I remembered how that article had gone viral, how it had led to a full state audit and a shutdown of operations. And for the first time I thought maybe this was who I needed, so I drafted an email, and I attached the documents, no explanations, no background, just files, and a message saying I had proof of financial misconduct by a well-known company in Colorado. And within minutes she responded. Her message was short. She asked if I was available for a call, and I stepped outside into the cold night air and answered, and her voice was calm, steady, direct, and she asked the right questions, the kind of questions that told me she was not surprised by what I had sent. And once she confirmed the files were authentic, she said she would begin her own investigation right away. And when the call ended, I stood there on the sidewalk outside the cafe, breathing in the cold like it was my first breath in years. And I knew something irreversible had just happened, something final, something powerful. And I walked away from that cafe, not with fear, but with clarity, because the truth was no longer just mine. It was out there now, and whatever came next would not be about me getting revenge. It would be about making sure they were finally held accountable. And while I walked down that street, the party was still going on behind the glass walls of that fancy venue, everyone dressed up, everyone laughing, everyone pretending everything was perfect. But I knew what was coming, I knew what was about to break through, and I knew that none of them, not Brooke, not my parents, not anyone in that room, was ready for the moment when their lies would start to unravel. Right in front of everyone, they were trying to impress, and I kept walking, phone in my pocket. No plan, no script, just the weight of my decision in my chest, and the peace that came with finally choosing to act instead of waiting to be seen. Back inside the venue where the celebration had been planned for weeks, Everything seemed to flow as perfectly as it always did, soft lighting, elegant decorations, laughter and handshakes and speeches, all perfectly timed and polished like the hundreds of events the Cole family had hosted over the years, and no one inside that room knew what was already unfolding outside their carefully crafted world at that exact moment. The first ripples of what I had set in motion were beginning to break through, and it did not start loud, it started quietly, almost imperceptibly, the way a small crack appears in glass long before the pane gives way. It started when a man standing near the bar lowered his phone slowly, his brows pulling together as he read the screen, and then looked up, scanning the room like he needed to check if the place matched what he was seeing. And a few feet away another guest looked at her phone and let out a small surprised breath, her lips moving silently as she read the headline again. And then more screens lit up, one after the other, glowing in the dimness of the venue as notifications arrived simultaneously. The article had gone live. The investigation, published by Elijah Park, was now out in the world, and it was spreading like a quiet storm inside that hall, a room filled with donors, clients, city partners, vendors, media figures, and friends, all gathered to celebrate Gregory and Margaret Cole and their legacy. And what they began to read was not about celebration or success. It was about fraud, payroll manipulation, grant misuse, and shady financial dealings, all backed up by real documents, all laid out in simple, irrefutable language with screenshots, dates, transaction summaries, and witness accounts. And no matter how beautifully decorated that venue was, nothing could protect them from what those guests now held in their hands. One by one, conversations stalled, smiles froze in place, wine glasses were set down untouched, and heads began to turn toward the center of the room where Brooke stood confidently managing the flow of the evening, still unaware that the ground beneath her was about to shift. And someone approached her, phone in hand, voice low but serious, and she leaned in, confused at first, then defensive, and then suddenly her entire posture changed, and within moments more guests joined, more questions came, people whispering, showing one another their screens, and the atmosphere turned tight, strained. No one was shouting, but something about the silence made it worse, and that was when a man in a dark coat walked through the main entrance, his expression focused, and his badge clearly visible. He was from the State Labor Department, and he did not wait for an invitation or an introduction. He simply moved with purpose through the crowd, which now parted instinctively to make space, and he spoke quietly with a few of the senior staff members and asked for documents and access, and his questions were not casual, they were procedural and specific, and the staff scrambled to respond, trying to remain calm, but their movements were now sharp and unsettled, and all around them the energy had shifted, the glamour of the evening evaporated in an instant, and what replaced it was something colder, more real, something that could not be explained away with charm. Deflected with smiles, a small group of guests began making calls, stepping outside, their voices urgent and clipped, and others stayed rooted in place, watching as the story they thought they knew began to fall apart. Brooke tried to regain control, addressing the crowd, trying to downplay what was happening, saying there had been a misunderstanding, saying they would handle things internally, but her voice trembled, and she could not meet the eyes of the people she spoke to. And Gregory stood stiffly near the main table, Margaret beside him, her hand clenched tightly around a wine glass, her expression unreadable, but her knuckles white. And a few feet away, one of the vendors began packing up early, her team folding linen and closing containers, not with panic, but with precision, as if they had done this before, as if they knew what it meant when the music stopped fitting the mood, and the air turned heavy. And I was not there in person, but I could see it all so clearly as if I had been, because I had been part of that world. I knew the rhythms of those nights, and I knew exactly how they would react when the illusion shattered. And what they were learning now was that the illusion had never been real, not for the people who worked overtime without pay, not for the suppliers who were misled, not for the clients who believed every detail was ethically handled. And as more guests pulled up the article and read it in full, the trust began to fracture. Some were stunned, others angry, some simply disgusted, and the staff tried to maintain professionalism, but cracks were showing in their posture, in their eyes, and every time someone read a line that matched what they had personally experienced, the weight of truth became harder to ignore. And it was not long before someone from investigation team asked to see payroll records on site, and a few employees were taken aside for interviews, not accused, not cornered, just quietly spoken to respectfully, but firmly, and it became clear this was not a drill, not a rumor, not a smear campaign. This was real, and it had been coming for a long time, and the people in that room were not just guests anymore. They were witnesses to the unraveling of a reputation built over decades, and outside the venue I kept walking, not with any particular destination, just letting the night guide me, and the city felt different, like it had shifted with me, like it understood that something had broken open and could not be closed again, and my phone buzzed with updates, Alicia sending confirmation after confirmation, the story being shared, picked up by news aggregators, retweeted, reposted, commented on, the documents being studied by other journalists, lawyers, maybe even prosecutors, and for the first time in my life I did not feel like a shadow in my own story. I felt like someone who had finally done what needed to be done, and the door they closed in my face that night had not shut me out. It had set me free, because the moment they told me I was not family anymore was the moment they lost the power to silence me, and now they would have to face everything they had done, not just in private, but in public, in front of the very people they had spent their lives trying to impress, and whatever happened next would not be a secret, not anymore. Because the truth had entered the room, and it had no intention of leaving quietly. The next morning came quietly, as if the city itself knew what had happened the night before and did not dare make a sound, and I moved around my apartment in slow, careful motions, like every step was part of a ritual I had waited years to begin. I made coffee not because I needed comfort, but because the process helped me focus. The scoop, the water, the heat, the steam, all of it grounded me, and while it brewed I checked my phone, and the notifications had doubled, tripled: articles, editorials, screenshots from the event itself, and more messages from Alicia letting me know that the response was already beyond anything we had expected. The story had been shared by other outlets, picked up by national press accounts, experts commenting publicly, community groups reacting with outrage and support, some shocked, some unsurprised, and all around me the narrative was shifting from whispers to headlines, and I stood there letting it settle, not with joy, not with fear, but with stillness, the kind of stillness that comes after a storm, not before. And then came the knock, firm, intentional, not rushed, not hesitant. And when I opened the door, I was not surprised to see them there, the three people who had once shaped every part of my life, Gregory, Margaret, and Brooke, standing in a line on my doorstep, their faces drawn, their bodies tight with tension. They did not look like the confident people from the news articles or the promotional videos. They looked like people who had finally realized that the ground beneath them was no longer stable. I stepped aside without speaking, letting them in, not because I wanted to offer warmth, but because I wanted to hear what they had to say, and they entered like strangers, careful with each step, glancing around my apartment like they were searching for something that might explain who I had become since they stopped looking. And they sat together on the edge of the couch, close but not united, and no one spoke for a long moment, until Gregory cleared his throat and started talking about the damage the article had caused, the phone calls, the emails, the vendor cancellations, the questions from officials, the bookings that were now uncertain, and the trust that had begun to erode. And he said all of this not in anger but in confusion, like he still could not believe this was real. And Margaret followed him, her voice softer, measured, as she explained how much they had worked, how much they had built, how hard it was to see it unravel in a single night. And Brooke stayed silent, her jaw tight, her hands clasped in front of her, as if holding on to the last pieces of control. And underneath their words was a plea, a request they were too proud to say clearly. Wanted me to fix it, to undo it, to find some way to stop what had already begun. And I listened without nodding, without reacting, just absorbing their discomfort, their desperation, their unwillingness to say the one thing I needed to hear. And then finally Brooke spoke, and when she did, her voice was sharp and practiced, the voice of someone used to running meetings, not making apologies. She said the article was exaggerated, that the journalist had taken things out of context, that internal matters should never have been made public, and that if I cared about the family, I would have come to them first. And I let her speak, let her finish every word before I looked her in the eyes, and told her that I had come to them before, that I had raised concerns, that I had asked questions, and had been shut down, erased, pushed aside, and that the silence I received then was the reason their world was crumbling now, and before she could respond another knock came, this one softer, familiar, and when I opened the door Tyler was standing there, and for a moment he looked like he might turn around and leave, but then he stepped forward and into the room, and everything changed. His presence was like a weight being added to the truth, and the way he stood, the way he looked at each of them. It was clear he had made his choice, and he spoke not loudly but clearly, and he said he had seen the irregularities, he had known about the problems for a long time, and that fear had kept him from speaking, but no more. He said he would no longer be part of something built on manipulation and fraud, and that from this moment forward he was stepping away from the company permanently, and the silence that followed was the kind that breaks something deep, because Gregory looked like someone who had lost more than money, and Margaret looked like she wanted to argue, but had no strength left, and Brooke looked at Tyler like he was a traitor, but she said nothing, and I realized in that moment that this was what it meant for truth to carry its own power, that once it was spoken, it moved with a force that could not be stopped. And I turned to them, and I said I would not be silenced. I said the choices they made had led to this, and that the responsibility was theirs, not mine. And when they left, they did not slam the door, they did not argue, they just walked out quietly, and I stood there in the center of my apartment with Tyler beside me, and I felt something I had never felt before, not victory, not vindication, but clarity and peace, because this time they had come to me, not with control, not with commands, but with the realization that they had lost something they never thought could be taken away, and I had not taken it through revenge or anger, but through truth. And now that truth was out in the world, and it would do what it was meant to do without my help, without my presence, without my pain. And for the first time in years, I felt free, truly free. The days that followed moved quickly but not chaotically. It was like a tide that had been waiting just beneath the surface, had finally been released. And there was no way to stop it now. Within 1 week of the article going public, state officials had launched a full-scale inquiry into Coal Event Group, and it was not just talk, it was action. They began by freezing all pending grant disbursements tied to the company, which meant anything they had been expecting in terms of relief or funding was immediately put on hold. Then came the calls from major partners, some of whom had been working with the company for over a decade, asking questions that could not be answered and requesting clarity that could not be given, and those conversations did not stay private for long. A few of the vendors posted publicly about pausing their partnerships, citing concerns about compliance and ethics, and one that happened, others followed one after another. Events were canceled or rerouted to other venues. Contracts were withdrawn, and the perfect image of Coal Event Group as a symbol of prestige began to fall apart piece by piece, and internally things were no better. Employees who had worked quietly for years started sharing what they had seen, what they had been told to overlook time cards edited to cut hours, staff being asked to work off the clock, missing overtime, no compensation for late-night cleanups after weddings and galas. And it was not just one or two voices, it was dozens, and once they felt safe enough to speak, the stories came forward without hesitation. Monica Alvarez, who had handed me those payroll files long ago, turned out to be the person the investigators leaned on the most. She was calm and professional, and she had receipts, not just verbal testimony, but copies of directive and internal memos showing exactly how long this had been going on and how deeply it was embedded in the culture of the company. And the investigators listened carefully and followed every lead, and what they found was not just an isolated mistake or an accidental oversight. It was systemic, a way of operating that had been allowed to continue because no one had dared to challenge it until now. And 6 months after the article went live, the full report from the Regulatory Commission was released, and it was damning. It outlined multiple violations across payroll, accounting, and ethics, and it recommended both financial penalties and structural changes. Coal Event Group was forced to reduce operations, closing 2 of their largest venues and selling off another to meet settlement obligations, and that move alone sent waves through the industry because for years that venue had been the crown jewel, the place where they hosted celebrities and political fundraisers, and now it was gone, and the family name, the name they had built their brand around, became a question mark in every conversation that used to treat it as a guarantee. And people who had once been eager to attend coal events, now looked elsewhere, and vendors who had once accepted late payments and last-minute changes now asked for everything in writing and in advance, and inside the company things began to change too. Brooke stepped down from her executive role, quietly, no press release, no public statement, just an internal notice sent to a list of contacts, and while the message framed it as a personal decision, those close to her knew she had not been given a choice, and with her departure, the leadership void exposed the truth that most of the vision had come from fear and image management rather than real strategy. And Gregory and Margaret remained involved, but their influence had dimmed. They no longer spoke at business events or industry panels. They stopped attending galas and conferences, and their usual circle of supporters grew distant, not because of hate, but because of caution, and the isolation was visible. Not in dramatic gestures, but in the way their phone calls were returned slower, their invitations declined, and their power no longer assumed. And in the middle of all this, I stayed quiet, not because I was hiding, but because I did not need to speak. Everything that needed to be said had already been said, and the proof had done its job. And while they tried to patch together what remained, I focused on my own world, my own business. The small accounting firm they once dismissed as a hobby was now expanding. I hired 2 new team members, added more clients, and was being approached by people who said they trusted me because of how I had handled the coal situation, and it felt strange and steady and real, because none of it came from a name or a family legacy. It came from the work and from the truth, and even though I had more on my plate than ever before, I moved through it with calm, with purpose. I no longer second-guessed every decision or held back questions out of fear that someone might get offended. I had already faced the worst of that, and survived, and more than that, I had won. And yet, even with all that progress, some part of me knew that the story was not completely finished, because accountability might reshape a business, but closure was something else, and I felt it in small moments, like when I walked past a newsstand and saw Brooke on the cover of a magazine, not for praise but for commentary, or when I got invited to speak on a podcast about ethics in family businesses, and declined not out of fear but because I did not need to relive it publicly. And then one evening, just as the sun was setting, and I was reviewing quarterly reports at my desk, my phone lit up with a message from a number. I still recognized it was Margaret. She had only written one sentence asking if we could meet, nothing more, no explanation, no pleading, just that. And I stared at it for a long moment, then replied and said yes, and we met at a small park near my office, the kind with benches and wide paths and the smell of fresh grass, and they were all there, Gregory, Margaret, and Brooke, walking slowly toward me, not with confidence or rehearsed apologies, but with hesitation. And when they reached me, they did not launch into a speech. Instead, they spoke in fragments, sentences that broke apart as they tried to name what had gone wrong, and they admitted that they had ignored signs, that they had chosen appearance over substance, that they had prioritized loyalty to the business over fairness, and that they had failed to protect the people who trusted them. And I listened and did not interrupt. And when it was my turn to speak, I told them I believed they meant it, that I accepted their apology, but that acceptance was not an invitation that I could forgive them, but I would not return to being part of that world, not now, not ever. And they understood, and there were no hugs, no tears, no dramatic endings, just a moment of quiet where all of us looked at each other without pretending. And then we went out separate ways, each of us stepping into a future shaped by the choices we had made. And as I walked back toward my office, the sun dipped lower, and I realized that the real power in this story had never been about breaking something down. It had been about standing up and knowing when to walk away, and when to speak, and when to choose truth over approval. And that was something they could never take from me again. It had been months since the night everything changed, and while the headlines began to fade, and the attention of the public turned to other scandals, other stories, the impact of what had happened still echoed in every corner of the Cole family, and their once untouchable empire, what I had exposed, was no longer just a story, it was a documented reality, and there was no way to undo that, no way to erase the screenshots, the testimonies, or the financial records that now lived in permanent public archives. And even though the official investigations had concluded and the fines had been issued, The settlements negotiated, the weight of truth had not finished its work, because truth does not just land, it settles, it takes root, and it transforms, and that is exactly what it did to each of them piece by piece. And quietly over time I began hearing about the aftermath, not because I asked, but because people told me, unprompted people. I had once worked with people who had stayed in the company long enough to see what came next. After the spotlight faded, Gregory and Margaret kept trying to maintain a version of control by staying active in the remaining parts of the business, but the power they once held had shrunk, and they knew it. Venues that used to book out a year in advance now struggled to fill weekends. Partnerships they had counted on dissolved quietly, and even their loyal inner circle began to slip away, not in dramatic exits, but in slow absences. People stopped showing up to meetings or failed to respond to Cole's invitations, went unanswered, and as their circle grew smaller, so did their confidence. Gregory stopped giving public talks, and Margaret resigned from the advisory board she once chaired, and in their place stood something neither of them had expected: a reputation built over 30 years, reduced to a cautionary tale discussed in business, ethics, seminars, and online forums, as an example of what happens when appearances take priority over accountability. And Brooke, who had always carried herself like the heir apparent, had moved out of the spotlight altogether. Her resignation had been packaged as a personal decision, but those close to her knew it had not been optional. And after that she disappeared from the professional scene. No new ventures, no interviews, just silence. And the silence said more than words ever could, because Brooke had always been loud, always present, always first to step forward, and now she was invisible, and it was not hard to imagine what that meant. And yet, for all of their loss, the one thing none of them could seem to accept was that this had never been about revenge. It had been about truth, about honesty, about finally refusing to shrink myself for the sake of keeping a false peace. And in those months I turned my attention inward to the small business I had built, and for the first time in years I let myself grow without fear. I took on new clients, expanded my services, hired staff, and moved into a bigger space, and I did it all quietly, not to prove a point, but because I had work to do, because I no longer needed to measure my value through their eyes. And as the business grew, so did my sense of purpose. I had found something steady, something real, and every morning when I walked into my office, I knew that I had earned it. Not through manipulation or branding, but through integrity and consistency, and that feeling was something no one could take from me. And yet, despite all the movement, all the growth, closure did not come all at once. It came in pieces, small realizations, quiet moments, the kind that do not announce themselves but still matter deeply, like the first time I saw a wedding announcement from one of our former clients choosing a new venue, one that was not owned by the Coles, and I smiled, not because it hurt them, but because I knew they were finally seeing past the illusion. And another time when a vendor reached out to ask if I would speak to their staff about financial transparency, and I said yes, not because I wanted to be in the spotlight, but because I knew I had something to offer. And each time those moments added up until the distance between me and that family grew wide enough to feel safe. And still one afternoon the past came knocking again, not with drama, but with a text from Margaret, short and simple, asking to meet again, just the two of us. And I debated it for a full day before replying yes, and we met at a quiet place, a garden tucked behind a library. She was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench under the shade of a tree. And this time she looked different, not just older, but lighter, as if something in her had let go. And when I sat beside her, she did not try to explain anything. She simply said she was sorry, not for the consequences, not for the fallout, but for the way they had treated me, for making me feel like I did not belong, for shutting the door on me that night. And she said she had known even back then that what they were doing was wrong, but she had not known how to stop it. And by the time she did, it was too late. And I listened quietly, not because I needed the apology, but because I wanted to hear if she meant it. And she did, and we sat in silence for a while, watching the leaves move in the wind. And I told her that I forgave her, but that forgiveness did not mean return, that I could wish her peace without stepping back into that life. And she nodded slowly, as if she had expected that, and we parted with a small quiet understanding, not a reunion, but a release. And afterward I walked away feeling lighter, not because anything had been fixed, but because I had stopped carrying their shame as my own. And that was the moment I knew the story had truly ended not with headlines or confrontation, but with quiet honesty and the choice to move forward and never look back again. In the weeks that followed the last meeting with Margaret, something inside me settled in a way I had never known before. It was not peace in the way people describe it, like calm waves or soft music. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of peace that comes when you no longer need to keep proving your own worth, and each morning I woke up with purpose and direction, knowing exactly what I had built and what I would continue to grow. My office became a space of focus and momentum, not just for me, but for the people I had brought on, and every person I hired carried the same values I lived by. Transparency, consistency, accountability, and care, and we did not rush, we did not cut corners, and we never hid behind excuses. Our clients began to notice, and they told others, and by the end of that year, my small accounting firm had doubled in size, not just in profit, but in strength. We had taken on more clients, expanded into new service areas, and I had even been invited to speak at a local business leadership forum. And although I politely declined the invitation, the simple fact that they had asked felt like a full circle moment. And as the work grew steadier, the memories of what happened with the Cole family began to drift to the edges of my mind, not disappearing completely, but softening, losing their ability to sting. And I no longer felt the same ache when I passed the venues they used to own, or when I overheard their name mentioned in a conversation around town. And in those moments I knew without a doubt that I had broken free from their orbit for good. But closure is not always about walking away. Sometimes it is about looking back just long enough to understand how far you have come. And I found myself doing that one evening as I sat alone in my apartment revisiting the folder that started everything, not out of anger or curiosity, but out of reflection, and I clicked through the files slowly, one by one. The documents that had once weighed me down now looked like proof of growth, not just for the company, but for me, because each line, each number, each false entry was a moment I chose not to ignore, and it reminded me that doing the right thing is rarely easy but always necessary. And I closed the folder and shut my laptop and let the silence fill the room, and that was when I realized I had not cried once since that night at the venue, not when they turned me away, not when the article went live, not even when they came to my door. And I did not cry now because I had already done my grieving years ago. Every time I was overlooked, every time I was told I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too distant, every time I swallowed disappointment and told myself to try harder, to be better, to make myself useful, to prove that I deserved space in a family that never saw me fully. And now there was no space left to fight for, and I did not need it anymore. And sometime after that evening, I ran into someone from the old world, a vendor who used to work closely with Brooke, and she recognized me immediately and came over, and we talked briefly, catching up on surface level things. And then she said something that stayed with me. She said, "I never really knew what went on behind those polished events until your story came out." And she said, "Thank you for telling it." And for a moment I did not know what to say, but I nodded and smiled, and we parted ways. And as I walked away, I felt something shift, because her words reminded me that telling the truth is never just about you. It reaches people you never expected, people who were watching, people who were afraid, people who needed someone to speak first. And that became the thread I held on to as I continued building not just a business, but a way of living that honored that truth. And it showed up in everything we did, from how we trained our staff to how we responded to mistakes. Because yes, even now we still made mistakes, but we owned them, and we learned from them, and we corrected them without hiding. And that culture drew people in, clients who had left other firms because they felt unseen, staff who had left toxic workspaces looking for something different. And I welcomed them, not with grand promises, but with clarity and consistency. And little by little, our firm became more than just a service, it became a standard. And through all of it, I never used the Cole name to boost us, never told the story in public interviews, never gave sound bites to curious bloggers, because this was not about vengeance, and it never had been. It was about stepping out of the shadows and into my own space, and letting that be enough. And it was more than enough, it was everything. And on the 1-year anniversary of the night, they told me I was not family anymore. I did not mark it with anger or bitterness. I marked it by taking the day off, by going to a quiet place near the river and sitting in the sun with a book in my hand and a cup of tea. And for the first time I let myself look back, not with pain, but with perspective, and I thought about the girl who had flown across the country with a carefully wrapped gift in her bag, and hope in her heart, and I wished I could go back and tell her that she would be okay, that she would survive the silence, the rejection, the cold faces at the door, and that she would go on to do more than just survive. She would thrive and lead and grow, and she would never again ask anyone for permission to exist or belong. And in that moment I felt proud of her and proud of myself, because we were the same and yet not the same, and that was the beauty of growth. It changes you without erasing you, it expands you without hardening you. And when the sun dipped behind the trees and the light began to fade, I stood up, brushed the grass from my coat, and walked away knowing exactly who I was and exactly what I had built and exactly what I would never allow again, and I did not look back. Even though the outside world had moved on from the Cole family scandal, the impact still echoed like an aftershock in every corner of their lives, and in the places they once held power and respect. And what made it even more obvious was that no one needed to say anything publicly anymore. No statements, no press briefings, no attempts at image repair, because the silence had become the loudest response of all, and the venues they once filled with high-profile weddings and corporate galas now stood half-booked with hesitant clients unsure of whether to trust the Cole name ever again. And one of their oldest city contracts was not renewed after 2 decades of steady partnership. The decision was announced in a short and simple press release that cited a shift in vendor strategy, but everyone who followed the industry knew the truth. It was a clean break from something that had become unstable, and in the months that followed, more clients pulled out with polite emails and vague language that always hinted at the same thing: they no longer believed in the brand. And inside the company, the pressure only got worse. There were attempts to restructure, to reorganize, to offer promotions and discounts, but none of it changed the atmosphere. None of it stopped the slow internal collapse. And one of their senior planners left suddenly just days before a major event, and that alone sent another wave through the already shaking foundation, because she had been with them for almost 10 years and had managed some of their most successful contracts, and now she was gone. No farewell, no explanation, just a quiet resignation. And the ones who stayed did so out of necessity, not loyalty. And I knew, because some of them reached out to me privately, not to gossip or complain, but because they wanted to thank me, because they said they had felt the weight of silence for too long, and now that it had broken, they could finally breathe. And I never asked them for details, never asked for praise, but I listened, and I told them what they had experienced mattered, and that no one deserved to feel small just to keep a company image intact. And I meant it, because I remembered what it felt like to hold my breath every time I asked a hard question. And now I was in a space where asking questions was expected, respected, and rewarded. And one of the most important moments came during a quiet Tuesday afternoon when I got an email from a nonprofit organization that worked with young professionals in business ethics. They asked if I would speak to a small group of interns, not to tell my story in full, but to talk about the value of standing your ground and documenting what you see. And I almost said no, not because I was afraid, but because I did not want to make this my entire identity. But then I thought about the interns, the young people entering the workforce with idealism and uncertainty, and I said yes. And when the day came, I stood in front of 15 young adults in a modest conference room with no cameras, no microphones, just a whiteboard and folding chairs, and I told them what I had learned. I told them that silence is not always safe, that documentation is not betrayal, and that speaking the truth is not about burning bridges, but about refusing to build on lies. And I did not name names. I did not talk about family or specifics. I just gave them what I wish someone had given me: the permission to trust themselves. And afterward, one of them came up to me and said, "Thank you. I needed to hear that today, and that was enough." And I walked out of that room into the evening light with the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had done something useful, something good, not for my reputation, but for theirs, for the future they were stepping into. And later that night, I sat at my kitchen table sipping tea and thinking about how different my life had become and how far I had come from the woman who once waited for validation at a closed door. And I realized that my greatest success had not been the exposure or the investigation or even the growth of my firm. It had been the simple fact that I now measured my worth on my own terms. And as for the Cole family, they continued on in whatever way they could. Gregory and Margaret maintained what was left of the business, but at a smaller scale, and in a quieter tone, and Brooke remained absent from the public scene, and none of them tried to reach out again, and I was fine with that, because closure had already come, not in a perfect package, but in layered truths spoken aloud, faced fully, and allowed to change what needed to change. And I had changed too. I had learned that family is not just blood or name. It is respect, it is truth, it is the ability to see someone fully and make space for them to exist as they are. And if you cannot offer that, then you do not get to define who belongs and who does not. And that lesson now shaped everything I did, from who I hired to how I led. And in that leadership I found something I never had before, not just confidence, but peace. And every once in a while, when I passed by a former coal venue, or saw the name in an outdated brochure, I did not flinch, I did not feel anger or pain, I felt nothing, and that nothing was a gift, a sign that the wound had closed, and what remained was only a scar that no longer dictated how I moved or who I became. And I knew that this story, my story, had become something bigger than a scandal. It had become a quiet reminder to anyone listening that you do not have to accept exclusion as truth, and that your voice matters, even when it shakes, even when it is quiet, even when no one wants to hear it, because sometimes the very act of speaking is what starts the change. Time did not erase what happened, but it did create space between then and now, space that allowed everyone involved to decide who they were going to become in the aftermath. And in that space I saw clearly that not all consequences are immediate. Some arrive slowly, like shadows stretching across the floor, growing longer as the sun goes down. And I watched from a distance as the Cole family tried to hold on to what was left of their empire, a once shining name now weighed down by scrutiny and silence. And they stopped giving interviews, they stopped making appearances at community events, stopped being the center of every room, and in their place came new businesses, new venues run by people who had learned from what they witnessed, people who understood that ethics and image are not the same thing. And every time I was asked for advice by someone starting their own firm or planning an event, I told them the same thing: make sure your numbers are as clean as your brand. And if something feels wrong, document it. Do not wait for someone else to fix it, because silence only protects the wrong people. And I lived by that advice in my own company, where we made transparency part of our policy, not just a word on the wall, but a daily practice. And the culture that grew from it was strong. People wanted to work with us, not because we were flashy, but because they knew we told the truth, even when it was hard. And over time that became our reputation, and it brought in the kind of client who stayed loyal, and the kind of team members who treated the business like it was their own. And it felt like everything I had once hoped to find in the Cole legacy I had now built on my own. And it did not need their name to matter, and that was the turning point when I realized the real inheritance I had always wanted was not money or venues or public recognition. It was the ability to walk into a room and know that I belonged there because of who I was, not because of who I was related to. And that shift changed everything. It changed how I spoke, how I carried myself, how I handled conflict, and how I approached new opportunities. And I no longer hesitated before setting boundaries or asking questions, because I had learned that discomfort is not the enemy, dishonesty is. And one afternoon, as I was reviewing a final audit for a local nonprofit, one of the board members paused during our meeting and said, "We trust you because you see things clearly and you do not flinch." And those words stayed with me, because for so long I had been afraid of being seen as difficult or dramatic, for noticing too much or asking too often. And now that exact quality had become the reason people came to me, and I would never apologize for it again. And yet, even in all that growth, I never stopped thinking about what it cost to get here, not because I missed the past, but because remembering kept me grounded. And there was a difference between dwelling and honoring, and I chose to honor what I had learned through the fire, because every time I thought about that night when I stood on the doorstep with a gift in my hand and hope in my chest, only to be told I was not family anymore, I remembered the cold, the silence, the way no one blinked or broke the line to pull me in. And that memory no longer hurt, but it reminded me of the truth that some doors are not meant to be reopened, and some titles are not worth reclaiming, and that sometimes you become your fullest self, not by going back, but by walking away, and in the end, that is what I did. I walked away from their version of me, from the roles they had carved for me, from the approval they used like currency, and I built a life that did not depend on any of it, and that life was honest and steady and deeply mine. And there were days I still thought about them in passing, not with anger, but with distance, the way you think about an old address where you once lived and no longer feel at home. And occasionally I would hear updates from others, brief mentions in conversation, or news of another venue sale, or an event that had quietly downsized. And each time I nodded and let the news pass through me without pulling me back, because I had nothing left to prove and no desire to reopen old wounds. And there was power in that, in staying forward, focused, in choosing where to invest your energy. And I invested mine in the people who stood with me, in the clients who trusted me, in the team who believed in the mission, and in the version of myself who had once been told she did not belong and had chosen to define her own belonging instead. And I carried that forward every day, into every decision, into every project, into every quiet moment when I remembered how far I had come and how deeply worth it the journey had been. Somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, I had stopped keeping track of what the Cole family was doing, not because I was avoiding it, but because it simply no longer mattered to the life I was living. And that realization came one morning as I sat at my desk preparing for a quarterly review with a client who had trusted me since the beginning, and I glanced at my calendar, saw how full the week was, how many projects we had lined up, and how every single one of them had come from trust, earned through work, not reputation, not family name, not branding. And I thought about how far I had come from that moment on the doorstep, with a gift in my hand and the sound of Brooke's voice telling me I was not family anymore, and how that voice had once held so much power over me, and now it was nothing more than a memory with no weight left to carry. And around that time a few old acquaintances started reaching out, people who had once turned away from me during the Cole years, suddenly wanting to reconnect, saying they had always admired my strength, or that they had not known the full story. And I responded politely but distantly, because I no longer needed anyone to validate what I had done. And I had learned that not everyone who returns is meant to stay, and I protected the world I had built carefully. I made sure that the people around me were there for the right reasons, not because of what they thought I could give them, but because of what we shared in values and in vision. And my team was strong, dedicated, honest, and there was not a day that went by that I did not feel grateful for them, because they had walked into this space not for a name, not for prestige, but for purpose, and that purpose drove us every single day. And it showed in the way we worked, in the way we communicated, and in the way we treated each other. And when challenges came, as they always do, we faced them head on, not by hiding, not by deflecting, but by addressing them directly, because we were not afraid of the truth. And that was what set us apart. And clients noticed. They sent thank you notes. They referred us to others, and our network grew not through marketing campaigns, but through integrity. And that was the kind of growth I had always dreamed of, growth that lasted, growth that meant something. And yet, even in the middle of all that stability, life has a way of circling back and testing you again. And one afternoon I received a letter in the mail, no return address, just my name printed neatly on the front, and inside was a short note handwritten in ink that I recognized instantly. It was from Brooke, and all it said was, I finally understand what you meant. I am sorry. I hope one day you will believe that. And for a long moment I just stared at the words, not knowing what to feel, because there had been a time when I would have done anything to hear that from her, when I would have clung to it like a life raft, hoping it would mean things could go back to how they used to be. But now things had changed too much, and so had I. And while the words mattered, they did not shift anything fundamental, because forgiveness had already happened, not in a conversation, not in a meeting, but in my own quiet journey to rebuild. And I tucked the note away, not out of anger, but out of respect, because it represented something finished, not something that needed to be reopened. And I carried on with my day just like always, because healing does not always arrive with a dramatic moment. Sometimes it arrives in the ability to continue doing what you love without being haunted by who hurt you. And I kept doing what I loved, guiding clients, supporting small businesses, helping people understand the stories their numbers told. and there was deep satisfaction in that, in seeing someone walk into my office with uncertainty and leave with clarity, and every time that happened I was reminded of why I had started all of this, not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove to myself that I could build something true, and I had, and in the background, the Cole family faded into something distant. Brooke remained out of the public space, Gregory and Margaret maintained a quieter version of their business, focused now on a few small events, a far cry from the empire they had once managed, and though I heard updates now and then, they no longer stirred anything in me. They were just names in a story that no longer belonged to me, and that freedom was priceless. It meant I could walk through any part of the city without flinching, without bracing myself for reminders of what was lost, because nothing had been lost, not really, only illusions, and illusions were meant to be broken, and truth was meant to rise, and in my truth I had found not only peace but purpose, and that purpose would carry me forward for as long as I chose to walk this path. The more distance I gained from the Cole legacy, the clearer everything became, not just what they had done, but how long I had stayed quiet for the sake of belonging, and I saw now how often I had accepted being pushed aside, how many times I had watered myself down just to keep the peace, how I had handed over pieces of my confidence, thinking that if I was small enough, they would finally make space for me, and it was not until they told me I was not family anymore that I realized how much of myself I had been handing over. And that moment, that one cruel sentence spoken without hesitation, had turned out to be a gift, a painful one, but still a gift, because it forced me to see that trying to earn love from people who only saw my value through what I could do for them would never bring peace. And from that moment on, I made a vow to never again beg for a seat at a table that did not respect me, and keeping that vow changed my life completely. It changed how I showed up for others, it changed how I protected myself, and it changed how I defined success, and I was not the only one who noticed, because people around me began to mirror that clarity. They started telling their own stories more boldly, choosing better boundaries, leaving places that made them feel small. And every time I saw that happen, I felt proud, not because I wanted credit, but because I understood how hard it was to walk away from what is familiar. Even when it hurts, you and I had done that, and I had survived, and even better than that, I had grown, and my business had grown with me. It was no longer just an office or a company. It was a reflection of every truth I had stood on, and the values I had refused to compromise, and we were not just growing in numbers, we were growing in depth, the way we served our clients, the way we trained our new hires, the way we made space for honest conversations when things went wrong. And one of the biggest projects of that year came from an unexpected place, a community development group looking for help auditing their budget after being misled by a previous firm. And when they walked into my office, they looked tired, guarded, like they had been through too much and trusted too little. And I listened to their story, not just the financial parts, but the emotional ones, the way it felt to be taken advantage of when you were trying to build something for others. And I promised them we would help, not just with spreadsheets, but with structure, with transparency, with rebuilding something solid. And we did, and when it was over, the director of that group shook my hand and said I did not think anyone would care this much about getting it right. And I told him that getting it right was the only way we worked. And as I drove home that evening, windows down, cool air on my face, I thought about how far I had come from the girl who once stood outside a venue holding a gift she was never allowed to give, and how that same girl now ran a business that made people feel seen, heard, and protected. And there was something sacred in that, and yet even in that sense of peace I was reminded from time to time that healing is not linear. It is a spiral, and it shows up in places you least expect, like the day I walked into a coffee shop and saw Margaret sitting alone at a back table, hands folded, eyes scanning the door like she was waiting for something. And for a second our eyes met, and we both froze, not out of hostility, but out of history, and she offered a nod, small, respectful, and I returned it, and walked to the other side of the room. And that was it. No conversation, no request for forgiveness, just a moment of recognition between two people who had finally understood that not all relationships are meant to be mended. Some are meant to teach and release, and that was the final confirmation I needed that I had truly let go, not because I had forgotten, but because I had forgiven without returning. And even though Margaret and I never spoke again, I hoped in that quiet moment she knew that I had found peace and that I wished the same for her, and that feeling followed me as I continued to build the life I had chosen, not the one I had inherited, not the one I had been told to pursue, but the one I had created out of pain and clarity and resilience. And there was no plaque on the wall to honor that, no certificate or title or award, but I did not need any of that, because every morning I woke up with a calm heart and a clear mind, and that was more than enough. The months kept passing, and with every quiet milestone I reached I felt the old wounds close a little more, not with a dramatic slam, but like a door finally swinging shut after years of being stuck halfway open. And I did not rush it, I let the healing arrive in its own time, in the small ways and subtle moments, like when I reorganized my office, not because I needed more space, but because I wanted to surround myself with only what felt like mine, or when I turned down a partnership opportunity that looked good on paper but did not align with my values, and I said no without fear, because I no longer made decisions based on what would impress the world or what would prove something to people who were not watching anymore. And my team noticed that shift, and they started leading with the same confidence and clarity. And we became more than just a firm. We became a place where people felt safe, bringing their full selves, their ideas, their concerns, their truths. And when mistakes happened, we addressed them head on, and we made corrections, and we moved forward stronger. And that culture began to attract attention, not in a flashy way, but in a steady wave of referrals from people who said they had heard we were different. And that word different used to scare me back when I was still trying to be accepted by the Cole family. But now it was my greatest asset, and it reminded me of all the times I had been told to stay in line, to be quiet, to not rock the boat, and how every time I chose to do the opposite, it brought me closer to who I really was. And I was not interested in perfection. I was interested in presence, in impact, in truth. And the truth was that what I had built now had a life of its own, and that life was rooted in something solid. And one morning I got a call from an old professor of mine, someone who had once encouraged me to pursue accounting, not because it was safe, but because it was powerful when done with integrity. And she told me she had been following my journey quietly, and she wanted to know if I would consider guest lecturing at the university. And without hesitation I said yes, not because I wanted to be seen, but because I wanted to be useful. And a few weeks later I stood in front of a room full of students and told them the story, not the family details, not the drama, but the lessons: how to trust your instincts, how to spot discrepancies, how to document everything, how to protect yourself in environments that reward silence and punish truth. And when I finished speaking, a student raised her hand and said, "How do you stay grounded when people in power try to make you doubt yourself?" And I said, "You remember who you were before they made you question it, and you build from there." And that answer stayed with me long after the class ended, because I knew it was not just for her, it was for me too. And later that week I received another message, this time from someone who had worked at Cole Event Group years ago, someone I barely remembered, and they wrote to say thank you for what you did, for showing us we were not imagining it, and for reminding us we were right to be uncomfortable. And I responded simply, "You were never crazy, you were just surrounded by people who needed you to stay quiet." And it felt good to write that, not as revenge, but as release, because everyone deserves to know they were not wrong for noticing what others ignored, and everyone deserves to feel seen. And that belief shaped every choice I made, every client I accepted, every person I promoted, every decision that came across my desk. And I had learned that leadership is not about control, it is about clarity. And the clearer I became, the more resilient we became as a company and as a team. And even when things got hard, and they did sometimes, we held the line, and we held each other. And I thought often about the night of that party, the glittering venue, the polished lies the door slammed in my face, and how none of those people ever imagined that the person they pushed out would be the one who brought everything they were hiding into the light. And not because I wanted to destroy them, but because I refused to be erased. And that decision had created a ripple that reached further than I ever imagined. And the beauty of it was that I did not need to chase those ripples. They moved on their own, through people, through impact, through truth. And I kept my focus on what was ahead, on what I was building, on who I was becoming, and I never looked back. By the time the 1 year mark passed since that night, everything fell apart. I no longer felt the weight of it pressing on my shoulders the way it once had. What had started as pain had turned into fuel, and then eventually into something softer and more stable, something that no longer needed to burn in order to keep me moving forward. And as that anniversary approached, I found myself reflecting not with sadness, but with a kind of quiet pride, because the version of me who had walked away from that venue holding a gift she never got to give had become someone I deeply admired, and not because she was perfect or fearless, but because she chose truth over comfort and clarity over chaos, and because she stopped chasing approval and started building something real. And in those 12 months, my life had expanded in ways I never imagined. My team had grown to more than double its original size. We had just moved into a new office space with big windows and natural light, and every time I stepped inside, I was reminded that this was built not from revenge but from integrity, and that reminder mattered because it helped me stay grounded even when success tried to pull me into performance, and I had no interest in putting on a show. I had done enough of that in the Cole family, and I was done with pretending, and that commitment to authenticity began to attract the kind of opportunities I never thought would come my way, like the email I received from a regional business magazine asking if they could feature my firm in a piece about small companies with strong ethical leadership. And my first instinct was to say no, because I still had a complicated relationship with being seen. But I paused and thought about all the people who had reached out to me over the past year, people who had read the article, people who had worked for the Cole family, people who had known something was wrong but did not know how to name it. And I realized that visibility was not always vanity, sometimes it was responsibility. So I said yes, and a few weeks later a journalist visited our office and asked thoughtful questions, not just about the business, but about the values behind it, and I told her everything honestly, not in detail about the past, but in depth about the principles we followed now, how every employee was trained to speak up, how every dollar was accounted for, how every project began with a values alignment meeting, and how those small decisions had created something unshakable. And when the article was published, the headline was simple but powerful: "The firm that rebuilt trust one spreadsheet at a time." And the feedback was overwhelming, not just from clients but from strangers who said they felt inspired to demand more from their workplaces. And I took none of it for granted. I knew exactly what it had cost to get here, and I carried that truth with me into every meeting, every contract, every conversation. And then one day, out of nowhere, I received a message from someone I never expected to hear from again. It was from Tyler, and all it said was, "I know too much time has passed, but I want to say thank you for being brave when I was not." And I stared at that message for a long time, not because I was unsure how to respond, but because it reminded me of how many people had been complicit in silence, not out of cruelty but out of fear, and how hard it must have been for him to carry the weight of that. And I wrote back simply, "You are not the only one who is scared. What matters is what you do next." And he replied, "I am ready to do better." And I believed him because I knew what it took to say those words, and it did not mean we became friends or reconnected beyond that, but it meant something, and that meaning was enough. And not long after that message, I heard from someone else, someone I had not thought about in years, an old client from back when I was still helping at Cole Event Group, and she told me she had recently read the full article and finally understood why her event years ago had felt so mismanaged, so dismissive, and she wanted to thank me for the work I was doing now, and she said it gave her closure. And that word stuck with me because I used to think closure came from apologies or accountability or justice, but now I understood that sometimes closure comes from building something beautiful after the break, and refusing to let the people who hurt you define what comes next. And that was what I had done every single day since they shut that door in my face. I had chosen myself and kept choosing myself again and again until it became second nature, and now there was no longer a need to revisit the past to prove anything to them, because the results spoke for themselves, and not just in numbers or articles, but in the peace I felt in my own body, in the steadiness of my own voice, and that peace had become my new legacy. The more time passed, the more I realized that the power of choosing yourself never stops rippling outward. It touches everything: your work, your relationships, your sense of peace. And I saw those ripples clearly one morning as I walked into the new office we had just finished renovating and paused by the window to take it all in: the light pouring through the tall glass, the sound of my team already laughing in the break room, the subtle, quiet confidence in the way they moved through the space they had helped build. This was not just a business anymore, it was a reflection of values and healing and strength, and it had all started with one terrible night when I had been told I was not family anymore, and yet somehow that moment had become the turning point that gave me everything I had been too afraid to claim before, and I carried that knowledge with me like armor, not to stay defensive, but to stay grounded. And I found that every decision I made now was rooted in that clarity, whether it was reviewing contracts or mentoring younger professionals or choosing how to expand next. And each step forward became an act of rewriting the story, not with revenge, but with intention. And then one afternoon, as I was preparing for a strategy meeting, my assistant walked in and said, "There is someone here asking to speak with you privately, and she looks familiar." And when I stepped into the lobby, I saw her standing there, Brooke, her hair tied back, her coat pressed and neat, but her eyes were soft. Then I remembered, not sharp, not guarded, just quiet, and she said my name and I nodded, and we walked into the smallest conference room and sat down across from each other in silence, and for a while neither of us spoke, and then she said, "I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I need to say something." And I told her I would listen, and what she said next came slowly, like each word weighed something real and heavy. She told me she had been watching from a distance, watching how the company I built had grown, how people spoke about it, how the values I talked about had become real practices. And she said she had spent years telling herself that what happened that night was necessary, that she had protected the brand, but that lately she could no longer believe that. And she said she now saw that in protecting the brand she had sacrificed something much more important. And I asked her what changed, and she said, "I started hearing my own voice in the people I dismissed. I started seeing how much harm we caused just to stay polished and in control. And now that I have lost that control, I finally understand what you were trying to tell us all those years." And I asked her what she wanted from me, and she said nothing, just to be heard, just to be honest for once, without power in the way. And I let her speak because I could see that something had truly shifted. And when she finished, she said, "I am sorry. I am sorry for pushing you out, for making you the problem, for not listening." And I told her I accepted her apology, but that it would not change where we stood. And she nodded and said, "I understand. I did not come to fix the past. I just needed to say it out loud." And we sat there in the quiet of that room, with the city noise muffled by thick glass, and I felt no tension, no rage, no desire to rewind time and make it different, because I had already made peace with what happened, and I had built something stronger because of it. And after a while she stood and I stood, and we exchanged a quiet goodbye, and she left, and I walked back into my meeting, not shaken, not sad, but deeply still. And later that night I thought about what it meant to be apologized to by the person who once led the charge to erase you, and I realized that the power of healing does not always come from that moment. It comes from what you have done with the silence in between. And I had taken that silence and turned it into something unbreakable. I did not know what I expected from the future, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I would never again shrink myself to fit into places that treated me like I was temporary. I had already spent too many years asking for space at a table that was never built with me in mind, and now I was building my own table, one that had enough room for truth, for growth, for courage. And every single day I chose to stay at that table was a reminder of everything I had walked through to get here. It was a reminder that being pushed out of something that never really saw me was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of one I finally got to write on my own terms, and it showed up in the way I made decisions now, not out of fear, but from grounded confidence. It showed up in the way I led my team with clarity and consistency and care, and it showed up in how I treated people with the dignity I had once begged for in places that never offered it, and that became the legacy I carried not just for myself, but for everyone watching who wondered if they were allowed to choose differently, to walk away, to start over, to tell the truth. And I wanted them to know that yes, they were allowed, and not only were they allowed, it was sometimes the most necessary thing they could ever do, and I no longer needed revenge, no longer needed validation, no longer needed any public reckoning to feel whole, because I had already made peace with the truth, and that peace was the most powerful outcome of all. And then one spring morning, I stood outside the venue where it had all begun, the same one I had been turned away from, with a gift in my hand and silence on my lips. And I was not there for closure or confrontation. I was there because a client had booked the place for a financial wellness seminar. And they had asked me to speak, and I almost said no at first, but then I realized that walking into that space now, not as a guest, not as a forgotten daughter, but as a respected voice, was not about reclaiming anything, it was about redefining everything. And when I walked through those glass doors, there was no tension in my chest, no bitterness in my bones, just calm, and I gave my presentation clearly, simply, without ego, without apology. And afterward one of the attendees came up to me and said, "Your story changed how I think about starting my own business," and I thanked her and walked back out into the sun. And I realized in that moment that the past no longer owned any part of me, and that realization was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was quiet and solid and final. And a few weeks later I received one more letter, this time from Gregory and Margaret. It was brief, it was handwritten, it did not ask for anything, it only said, "We finally understand what you did and why you did it, and though we cannot undo the damage, we are trying to learn from it. Thank you." And I did not need to reply, not because I held resentment, but because nothing more needed to be said, and I placed the letter in a box with the others, the ones that marked the timeline of this story, and then I closed the box and put it away, not to hide it, but because it had served its purpose, and now I had other stories to live and other work to do. And when I looked around at the life I had created, I felt proud, not because it was perfect, but because it was mine, and it was honest, and it was earned. And I thought about that phrase she used that night, the words she threw like a blade, "You are not family anymore." And I smiled now because she had been right. I was not part of that family anymore. I was something else entirely. I was someone who had chosen truth over tradition, who had stepped into the fire and come out not burned but refined, and that was a title I would carry with pride for the rest of my life. Outro: this story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.